Hello. This is a video about using close-up lenses. Before we talk about close-up lenses, let's just think about macro lenses and how they work. This is a Canon DSLR, a 70D, with a macro lens on it, 105mm Sigma macro lens. And what a macro lens does is it lets you get much closer to your subject than would otherwise be possible. So here I've got the camera set up, so if I go in close, the image on the sensor is now the same size as the subject is in the real world. This is called one-to-one magnification, and that's what macro lenses do. There are lenses that have macro written on them which don't actually do that. Here's one. It's a lens for the same camera, a 55-250 STM lens, a Canon lens, and it's got macro written on it, but it doesn't let you get as close enough to get the image on the sensor the same size as the subject is in the real world. I think what they mean by this is this lens gets you closer to your subject than you normally could for a lens of this type, and indeed that's true, but it can be rather confusing. When I'm talking about macro lenses in this video, I'm talking about this sort of thing that goes to one-to-one. Now, if I want the subject to be smaller in the frame, I have to pull the camera away. So here it'll be half the size, and I have to move the camera quite a long way in order that it will focus. So that's the way that prime macro lenses work, and wonderful lenses they are, very sharp, and they photograph in a flat field. Most lenses will give you a curved field of what's in focus. These will give you a flat one, so if you're taking a picture of a postage stamp, for example, as long as you've got the camera straight onto it, if you have the centre of the postage stamp in focus, then the corners and the edges are going to be in focus too, which wouldn't be the case probably with an ordinary lens, a non-macro lens. Very nice pieces of kit. My preferred approach, though, is to use close-up lenses. There are two sorts of close-up lenses. This is what's called sometimes called a macro filter set. There are 4 in this, which is quite usual. They have numbers associated with them, +1, +2, +4 and +10, and the bigger the number is, you put this on the front of the camera lens, the bigger the number is, the closer you can get to the subject, and so the bigger the subject is in the frame, the greater the magnification. And the way you use these, here's one on the front of the zoom lens on a Panasonic G3. So if I go to full zoom, and I have to be at this distance to get it in focus, and if I want the subject to be smaller in the frame, if I want less magnification, I go to a wider angle, but I do have to move the camera in to get the distance right so it will focus. The problem with these close-up filters is that each of the filters is a single piece of glass, as opposed to the very complicated arrangement of glass in a macro lens. The result is that what you get isn't as sharp, and it's also likely to have chromatic aberration, which is red and green lines along areas, borders between bright and dark areas. So I prefer not to use those close-up filters, inexpensive as they are, and they're a good way to start. if you're not sure whether you're going to enjoy macros and close-ups or not, spend your £10, $10, whatever it is, get a set of 4 of them, stick them on the front of a zoom lens, and have a go, see if you like it. They're fine for that, but if you really get into it, you'll quite soon, I think, want to use some other method like prime macro lens or a close-up lens like I use. So these are close-up lenses. Now these have got more than one layer of glass, and that allows them to be sharper and also have much less, or in fact no visible, most of the time, no visible chromatic aberration. They have the same numbers associated with them. This one is a +2, so it's not very powerful. It's a Canon 500D close-up lens, and I use this for flowers mainly, or for large insects sometimes, like dragonflies or butterflies. This one is more powerful. It's a +4. It's a Raynox 150, and the next one in the series isn't here. It's on the camera, which we'll see in a moment. And that's a +8. It looks exactly the same as the Raynox 150, and it's a Raynox 250. And my most powerful achromat is a Raynox MSN 202, which is a +25. Here we see one of the achromats. This is the 4th of the achromats, a Raynox 250 on a Panasonic FZ200, and if I do the same as I did, exactly the same as with the close-up filter, if I want it big in the frame, a lot of magnification, there we go, I've got the distance right, and I now zoom back and adjust the distance a bit, and it's now much smaller in the frame. Let's just have a closer look at what's going on here. And if I get this so that I've now got the maximum magnification I'm full telephoto with the lens, and the distance between the end of the close-up lens and the subject is 120 millimeters about. If I now go to much more wide angle, so the subject is much smaller, in order to get it to focus I have to be, there we go, that's focusing now, and the distance now is, well, it's 120 again. And that's the deal with achromats, that you have to get the distance right. There is a certain distance that you need to be from the subject with each individual achromat. It's not to do with the magnification you're using, it's to do with the achromat you're using. The result of that is that when I've got the achromat on a lens which extends like this, and I change the magnification, I have to move the camera around. And I often do want to change magnification because I like to have, for example, a fly filling a lot of the frame and then a picture of it surrounded by the foliage that it's on. So I use a different approach. I have, and this is the same model of camera, it's a Panasonic FZ200, it's got the same achromat on it, a Raynox 250, but it's got this tube which screws onto the camera, and the achromat screws onto the tube. The result is that if I zoom right in, now you can't see it, but the lens is moving, has now moved right out to here. And I get the distance right, there we go, that focuses. If I now want it wide angle, so I zoom back and the lens is now, the camera lens is now back here, but I can still focus. So I can zoom in and out, changing the framing without having to move the camera. And that's very convenient, especially if I'm working with a tripod, which I do quite a lot of the time. Now the way I use a tripod is the way that a lot of people use a pole or a stick or a monopod, just something to give some support. You keep your hands on the camera, but having some support means that the shaking of your hands is damped down, and when you're using high magnification it can be very difficult to frame the subject. And the greater the magnification is, the more your hand movement is magnified and the picture's jiggling around all over the place. If you're using something to stabilise it, it doesn't move nearly as much, and it's much easier to frame shots. So I use the Acromat on the tube to keep it at the same distance with this FZ200. I do the same thing with, this is an interchangeable lens camera. It's a Panasonic G5 and it's got a zoom lens on it. But this zoom lens has the unusual characteristic that when you zoom out in and out, the length of the lens doesn't change. So that if I go to full zoom, focus on the subject, and there we go, that'll focus. And if I now go to full wide angle, it still focuses without moving the camera. And again, it's exactly the same benefit as with using the Acromat on a tube, on the FZ200. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that I've not actually been taking pictures at the moment, and that very often when you're taking close-ups and macros, especially as the magnification goes up, you're going to probably have to add some light to the scene by using a flash. And it's a different story, but just to illustrate what's going on, if I can zoom out a bit so we can get a better view. There's various ways of doing it. You can lift the camera flash and put something on which projects the light down over here. You can put a flash gun on here and again put some stuff on. This is diffusing the light, because if you just use a plain flash you get these very horrible strong highlights and it doesn't look nice at all. So people put a lot of effort into using different methods of getting the light to where you want it and diffusing it so that it doesn't make the picture look horrible. And a lot of people who do this make their own diffusers up because they prefer that to using the commercial diffusers. That's one way of doing it, with a single flash. And my current method of doing it is I've got one that's got two flashes on it, it's got bendy arms so that you can move these around, and it's got a light as well, which is very good for operating at night. It means I can take these close-ups and macros at night. And let's just get rid of the phone, sorry about that. But that's another whole story. This one incidentally is a Venus Optics KX800 twin flash, and again I've put quite a lot of research and development into what's going on here. It's not just something on the surface here, there's stuff underneath as well, all trying to produce a more even light for illuminating the subject. Now there is something to be said about why, if I go back to this prime macro lens, I said that this produces very sharp images. They're very nice lenses. Consider what I'm doing. I've got a relatively inexpensive and uncomplicated piece of glass on the front of here. It's got, I don't know, 3 layers, I think, something like that. It costs around £40. And I've put that, easy to see here, I've put that on a zoom lens, which is a very, it's a general purpose zoom lens on this camera, and it goes from wide angle to quite a lot of zoom, and obviously the optics of this are going to be nothing like as good as with the prime macro lens. So I've got 2 bits of glass working in combination, neither of which is anything like as good as one of these. So the picture I get isn't going to be as good as I get with one of these, is it? Maybe. It depends. One of the problems with macros and close-up, especially as the magnification increases, is the depth of field that you're working with. The distance between the front and the back of what's in focus is pretty small. Everyone who does close-ups and macros knows about this, and it's a problem. My way around it is to do something that most people won't, which is that I use very small apertures. Now the thing is that using a small aperture has two effects, one good, one bad. The good effect is that as the aperture decreases, the F number goes up, the amount that's in focus from front to back gets bigger. So if you use a very small aperture, you get a relatively large amount in focus front to back. At high magnification it's still not much, but it's a lot more than you would with a bigger aperture. The downside is that what's in focus isn't as sharp as it would be with a bigger aperture. So you've got a choice. You can either have a relatively large amount in focus, but not as sharp focus, not as detailed, as much fine detail in it, or you can have less in focus front to back, but have more detail in it. And most people prefer to use a larger aperture because they want as sharp an image as possible, because they're interested in the detail of the picture, which is fair enough. My preference is to have as much as possible in focus, and there's the question, when you do this, when you use a very small aperture, it turns out that these two bits of kit are not so very different, because the image is getting degraded in both cases, and it's getting degraded to the point where there's not a lot of point using more expensive and better kit, because you're just destroying the fine detail that you could get with it. Again, why do I do it? Well, because it's sharp enough for what I want, and you can have a look at my pictures. If you Google gardener's assistant, one word, GARDENERSASSISTANT, you'll get my Flickr account, and if you have a look at don't look at the photo stream, because that has a lot of boring stuff in it a lot of the time. If you have a look at the albums, or better even yet, have a look at the collections if you can find them. Flickr doesn't make that particularly easy. You'll be able to see the sort of thing that I do. And I produce pictures that are 1300 pixels high for viewing on screen, and I find, with a bit of post-processing, that the sharpness is adequate for my needs. Opinions vary greatly on this, and most people won't use the very small apertures that I do. So that's one of the reasons that I'm prepared to use this sort of setup, because with close-up lenses, when I've got my close-up lens mounted on the tube or on a lens that doesn't extend when I zoom, the operating characteristics I find very pleasing relative to using any other system. Since I'm using the very small apertures, I'm not losing a great deal in terms of sharpness. I'm getting the depth of field that I want, and say, in my view, for my purposes, the results are good enough. So there are lots of compromises. It's true you don't get the sharpness with these close-up lenses that you do with one of these, but again, it's all dependent upon how you use these things, what you use them for, and how you like to take your photos, whether you use a tripod, work handheld, whether you use flash or not, and so on. For my purposes, a close-up lens is frankly the best thing that I've found. I've got prime macro lens, a DSLR, I've had an MP65, a more powerful macro lens, but frankly I just didn't get on with it. I prefer to use these, but it's a very personal decision, and you must use what's best for you, and if you can, try different approaches and see what works for you. For me, it's close-up lenses. So that's all for now. Bye bye.